There's something humiliating about standing in front of your own house and realizing you've been locked out, not by a stranger, not by a thief, but by your own neighbors who call it community safety. That was the morning I learned what power really looks like. It's quiet, polite, and wrapped in bureaucracy. I still remember how the Texas sun burned across my shoulders as I carried 2 paper bags of groceries up the driveway. Sweat rolled down my neck, the air thick and dry, buzzing with cicadas that never seemed to stop. The hum of sprinklers from the next yard filled the silence, the kind that only happens in neighborhoods that pretend to be perfect. My daughter Maddie was inside studying for a test, and I'd promised her tacos for lunch. Nothing about that day felt unusual, until I saw the glint of metal on my gate. A new brass padlock hung from the latch, shining like a gold coin in the sun. At first I thought it was some kind of prank, but then I saw the paper taped just below it. Official HOA letterhead, bold red letters screaming at me, temporary access restriction, for community safety. The words didn't make sense. Access restriction. This was my driveway, my property, my mortgage, my life. I dropped the grocery bags, eggs cracking against the pavement as I tore the notice off the gate. My hands were trembling, but the words burned clear enough. In accordance with HOA Emergency Policy 7C, vehicular entry to Lot 28 is suspended pending safety review. Violation may result in fines. Signed, Martin Clive, President, Oak Willow Estates, HOA, Martin Clive. The name itself made my stomach turn. Every neighborhood has one, the kind of man who believes rules are religion and power is a public service. He was retired now, once a fire chief, and he carried himself like every house was still under his command. I'd seen him at meetings, correcting people mid-sentence, calling women ma'am with the same tone someone uses to say child. He'd been trying to get me written up for months. First for my non-conforming mailbox color, then for my visible trash can placement. Now, apparently, for existing. I stood there, staring at that lock, the metal catching sunlight so bright it made my eyes ache. The whole street was silent, except for the chirp of a mockingbird perched on the mailbox. For a moment, I wondered if someone was watching. HOA board members lived on this street too. People who waved at me every morning, smiling while they voted on the best way to control me. That's what it felt like. Control. Not about safety, not about rules, just control. I tried the latch gently, as if maybe it would give. It didn't. The chain was tight, heavy-duty, the kind of thing you use on a storage unit. I fished my house key ring from my bag and tried every key I owned, even the one to my studio shed out back. None fit. The lock clicked mockingly against metal every time I failed. Anger came next. That low, shaking kind that starts in your stomach and rises until your chest feels like it's about to crack open. I looked around at the identical beige houses, the neatly trimmed hedges, the spotless driveways. My groceries were melting in the heat, milk leaking from a crushed carton, and all I could think was who gave them permission to do this to me. Being a single mom in a neighborhood like Oak Willow wasn't easy. I'd moved here for Maddie, for the good schools, the quiet streets, the kind of safety I thought you could buy with HOA fees and clean sidewalks. I worked late nights designing marketing layouts from home, paying bills one careful dollar at a time. I didn't bother anyone. I didn't ask for trouble, but trouble had decided it wanted me. I could almost hear Martin's voice in my head. It's for everyone's safety, Rebecca. Don't take it personally. He loved saying that at meetings, as if stripping people of dignity was just another policy item. The Texas wind kicked up dust that stung my eyes. I stood there, gripping the gate, my palms red from pressing against the metal. For a second, I thought about calling the police. Then I imagined them laughing, telling me it was an HOA issue. That's how it always worked. You don't have to break a law to be trapped. You just have to let the wrong people make the rules. The groceries were ruined. The sun was unforgiving, and all I could do was stand there, staring at that ridiculous brass lock that had somehow turned my home into a prison. My vision blurred for a second, not from tears, but from something hotter, heavier, rage. I wiped my hands on my jeans, took a deep breath, and reached into my pocket for my driveway key. The one I'd used every day for the last 3 years. I fitted into the latch, twisted hard, waiting for that familiar click. It didn't budge. That's when I realized the key to my own home didn't work anymore. By the next morning, the brass lock was still there, gleaming like a trophy for whoever thought this was a good idea. The notice had fluttered halfway off the mailbox overnight, its corners curled from the humidity. I stood there with my coffee going cold in my hand, staring at it like maybe the words would change if I looked long enough. They didn't. The same smug signature sat at the bottom, Martin Clive, HOA president. I called the HOA office as soon as they opened. Or at least, when their website said they opened. The first call went straight to voicemail. Thank you for calling Oak Willow Estates Homeowners Association. Your call is very important to us. Then, hold music. Soft, generic piano. I waited 6 minutes, then 8. Finally, I hung up and redialed. Same loop. The third time, it cut me off mid-message. It felt intentional, like the phone system itself had been trained to ignore me. I sent an email. No reply. I texted the HOA number posted on the community board, nothing but silence. By noon, the heat was rising again, and my patience was thinning. Maddie called me from school, frustrated. Mom, I can't park anywhere. The gate's still locked. I told her to park near the playground and walk home, my throat tightening as I said it. The idea of my 15-year-old walking 2 blocks alone in the afternoon heat made me sick. When she got home, her face was red, her backpack sliding off one shoulder. They said you broke some rule about driveway spacing, she muttered. Everyone's talking about it. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about control, and they wanted everyone to see what happened when you crossed Martin Clive. The neighbors had started to notice too. I caught Janet Reyes watering her roses across the street. She glanced over nervously before whispering, "Don't cross Martin, Becca. He runs this place like a fortress." Her words lingered long after she turned away. I didn't want to believe people lived in fear of a man with a clipboard, but the more I looked around, the more I saw it. Cars parked perfectly within painted lines, grass trimmed like it had been measured. No one dared wave. No one dared question. By late afternoon, the sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled my attention to the road. A white SUV rolled up. New, spotless, and predictably labeled HOA Security. Martin Clive stepped out, his button-down tucked too tight, a clipboard in one hand, a smug smirk in the other. "Well, Rebecca," he said, adjusting his sunglasses, "we received word you've been interfering with HOA safety equipment." "Safety equipment?" I repeated, my voice trembling more from rage than fear. "You mean the lock you put on my own driveway?" He smiled the way someone does when they already think they've won. "Technically, that's community property," he said. "It's for everyone's protection, temporary measure." "For everyone's protection from what, me?" I asked, stepping closer. The faint smell of his cologne hit me, sharp, chemical, suffocating. "Don't make this personal," he said lightly, glancing at his clipboard as if reading from a script. "We just want compliance." I felt something crack inside me. Weeks of stress, overdue bills, long nights working just to stay ahead, all boiling under the surface until now. "You can't just block me from my own property," I said. "That's illegal." He tilted his head like I'd just told a joke. "Illegal? Oh, Rebecca. You really should read your bylaws before making accusations." I didn't know it then, but I was right. Later I'd learned the term for what he was doing: constructive trespass. Under property law, HOAs cannot physically obstruct an owner's access to their deeded land. But in that moment, those laws felt like distant concepts in a world where Martin Clive made the rules and everyone else just survived them. Maddie stood on the porch watching us, her face pale. "Mom," she whispered, "please don't yell." I wasn't yelling yet, but my voice carried. "You think locking me out makes you safe? You're trespassing, Martin." You crossed the line the moment you touched that gate. He didn't flinch. Tampering with HOA property is a serious violation, he said, pretending to take notes. And if you keep this up, I'll have no choice but to escalate. Escalate how? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He smiled again, that same fake courtesy that made my blood run cold. Let's not find out, he said before tapping his phone screen. For now, I'm calling the authorities. Let them handle this. Maybe they can explain the rules better than I can. I froze. You're calling the police? On me? He gave a polite little shrug. For tampering with HOA property. Nothing personal, of course. The sound of his phone dialing filled the silence. My neighbor's curtains shifted. A lawnmower stopped mid-run. The street grew still enough to hear my own heartbeat. That was the moment I realized no one was coming to help me. Not the neighbors. Not the HOA board. Not the police. It was just me, trapped, humiliated, and suddenly very aware that this wasn't about a gate anymore. This was a war I hadn't agreed to fight. The first thing I noticed was the color, blue flashing against the cream siding of my house, scattering light across the windows like a siren-colored storm. The next thing was the sound. That low hum of the cruiser idling at the curb, followed by the crunch of heavy boots on gravel. For one long second, I actually thought something terrible had happened to someone else. But when I opened the door, both officers were looking straight at me. Behind them stood Martin Clive, hands folded behind his back like a proud headmaster watching his favorite rule-breaker get scolded. His white SUV was parked at an angle, the words HOA enforcement vehicle neatly stenciled on the side. He gave a polite nod to the taller officer and said, "That's her. Becca Holt, Lot 28. She's been interfering with HOA safety installations." It took me a second to realize what he meant. The lock. The chain. My driveway. "Ma'am," the officer began carefully, "we got a call regarding a civil disturbance. Something about property tampering." I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. "You mean the lock on my driveway?" "That's my property. My house. My gate." Martin stepped forward, waving a paper that looked suspiciously like an official document, but probably wasn't. "She's been warned," he said, voice calm but dripping with smugness. "Our records show she violated Emergency Access Code Section 7C. Non-compliance with safety measures." The officer frowned, clearly confused. "Emergency access?" Martin nodded as if explaining something noble. "We had an incident a few months back. A loose dog, a fire risk. We've implemented security restrictions to protect residents. She's refusing to comply. Potential hazard." I could see one officer's doubt fighting with the other's desire to finish the call quickly. I turned to them, trying to hold my voice steady. "He locked me out of my own driveway. Without any legal notice, without a vote. That's my gate." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, it sounds like a civil matter between you and your homeowners association. We can't, force them to remove anything. You might want to contact a lawyer." I stared at him, speechless. "A lawyer? For a lock on my own driveway?" Martin smiled faintly. "You see, officers, she's not denying it. She's tampered with HOA equipment. I just wanted to make sure this was properly documented." Something inside me snapped. "Equipment? You chain my house like it's a crime scene." The older officer sighed. "Ma'am, please keep your voice down. We're not here to take sides." From the porch, I heard a small sound. Maddie. She stood barefoot, clutching the railing, her face pale and eyes wide. "Mom, what's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I swallowed hard, the shame rising like bile. "How do you explain to your daughter that you're being treated like a criminal for standing on your own property?" I wanted to tell her it was a misunderstanding, that the police were going to make it right. But I saw the truth written in the officer's careful expressions. They weren't here to help. They were here to make sure I didn't make noise. Martin glanced toward her, pretending concern. "It's all right, young lady," he said smoothly. "Your mom just needs to follow the rules. We all have to, you know." That did it. I stepped forward until I was face to face with him. Don't you ever talk to my daughter again? The officer quickly stepped between us. Okay, let's all take a breath here, he said. No one's under arrest, but we need to de-escalate. Martin nodded in satisfaction. Thank you, officers. I think we've made the point clear. He turned to leave, tucking his clipboard under his arm. The officers followed, one of them giving me that apologetic half-shrug people use when they're too afraid to say they believe you. The blue lights dimmed as the cruiser pulled away, and with it went every last piece of dignity I'd been holding on to. Maddie stepped off the porch and wrapped her arms around me. They made it look like you did something wrong, she said softly. I didn't, I whispered. I didn't do anything wrong. But inside, shame was giving way to something harder, resolve. If Martin Clive wanted to play by the rules, I'd learn every one of them better than he ever did. I was done being the quiet one. That night I sat at my kitchen table under the dull hum of the ceiling fan, laptop open, papers spread out. I looked up every property record I could find. I learned that driveways in most single-lot suburban developments are part of the deeded property, not common ground. And the kicker? Any obstruction, like a lock, could legally count as constructive trespass. The HOA had no right to block me from my own home. I didn't know exactly what I'd do yet, but I knew this. The next time Martin came to my door, I'd be ready. The next morning, as if to remind me who still thought he was in charge, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. White, crisp, official. Inside was a notice with bold black letters. Violation notice, $1,000 fine for interference with common property. I laughed once, bitterly, as the paper shook in my hands. I'd just been declared a criminal by my own community. By the time the fine notice arrived, something inside me had already shifted. Anger had burned through humiliation, leaving something sharper behind. Focus. If Martin wanted a fight on paper, then that's exactly where I'd take it. 2 mornings later, I parked my old Corolla in front of the Travis County Clerk's office. The building wasn't much to look at. Tan brick, faint smell of copier toner, and the echo of shoes on tile floors. I walked in clutching a folder of HOA letters, fines and photos of that lock gleaming on my gate like a scar. The clerk behind the counter, a tired woman with kind eyes, didn't even blink when I asked for the Oak Willow Estates Homeowners Association filings. Another one? She muttered, sliding a form across the counter. You wouldn't believe how many folks come in asking about that HOA. My heart skipped. What do you mean, another one? She gave a half shrug. They're active. Overstep a lot. You'll find what you need in public record. 10 minutes later, I was sitting at a table with a stack of manila folders taller than my coffee mug, each one filled with scanned minutes from board meetings, annual reports, and governing documents written in that cold, emotionless language only bureaucrats understand. I started flipping through, my eyes catching on words like fines, restrictions, authority, emergency measures. By the 3rd hour, my head was spinning. I'd read the same paragraph 5 times before realizing what it said. No member may be denied ingress or egress to their deeded property except by board vote and majority approval. My pulse quickened. There was no record of any vote for safety restrictions. No board signatures, no audit reports. Just one sheet of paper signed by Martin Clive, HOA president, under something called Emergency Authority Clause. Except there was no such clause listed anywhere in the bylaws. It was made up, a fabrication dressed as policy. I snapped a photo of the document with my phone. My hands were shaking, not from fear this time, but something close to exhilaration. For the first time since that lock appeared, I had power. Real, written proof that Martin had overstepped. That night, I called Clint Bowers, an old college acquaintance who worked as a paralegal downtown. He'd always had this easy way of making legal talk sound like common sense. When I told him what I'd found, he whistled low through the phone. Becca, that's bad. Really bad. For him. Can he just make up a rule like that? I asked. Not legally. Bylaws are like the HOA's Bible. If it's not in there, It doesn't exist. And if he filed something without a vote, that's a violation of fiduciary duty. You've got leverage. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion washing over me in waves. Clint, he's got everyone scared of him. People won't speak up. Then speak for them, he said simply. You've got the paperwork. And trust me, if they can lock you out once, they can do it to anyone. That line hit me harder than I expected. I looked around my small living room. Maddie's schoolbooks on the coffee table, the soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen, the faint smell of lavender detergent. This was home. My safe place. And I had almost let one man turn it into a cage. For the next few hours I became someone I barely recognized. I read every bylaw like a detective combing through clues, my notebook filling with phrases and legal references. Section 3B, Community access changes require board vote. Section 9A, no officer may act unilaterally. Every line I underlined felt like armor sliding into place. By midnight, I had a full outline of violations, dates, references, signatures, or lack thereof. It wasn't just personal anymore. It was systematic abuse wrapped in the language of community safety. Martin had been using fear to manipulate the neighborhood, and now I finally had proof. Maddie wandered out of her room sleepy-eyed. You're still up? Almost done, I said, smiling for the first time in days. I think I found something. She peered over my shoulder at the papers. You're actually reading that legal stuff? Yeah, I said, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. And I understand it. She yawned. What are you gonna do? I looked down at the bold heading, Unauthorized Access Restriction by Officer. My finger traced the signature at the bottom, Martin Clive. For the first time, I didn't feel scared of that name. I felt powerful. I'm gonna make sure he never does this to anyone else, I said quietly. When Maddie went back to bed, I stared out the window, the moonlight hitting the chain on my gate like a challenge. I whispered it aloud, testing the words as if they were the start of a plan. If he wants to play gatekeeper, I muttered, a slow grin spreading across my face. I'll make him pay admission. The night the idea came to me, the air was heavy with the smell of cedar and rebellion. I sat on my porch staring at the brass lock gleaming under the porch light like a taunt. Martin's lock. His control. His power over a street full of people too afraid to challenge him. I'd spent a week reading laws and filing papers, but what I needed now wasn't another document. It was a statement. Something louder. Something that would make him feel as small as he'd tried to make me. It started as a joke. Maddie had come out holding 2 mugs of cocoa, her voice soft. What if you charged him to use your driveway? She said with a half smile. I looked at her, the teenager who'd watched her mother be humiliated on her own property. And suddenly it didn't sound so crazy. You know what? I said, leaning back in my chair. Maybe I will. By the time she went to bed, the idea had taken root. I rummaged through the shed out back, dragging out scraps of lumber from when I'd built Maddie's old lemonade stand years ago. The boards were still solid, smelling faintly of paint and old summers. Under the dim glow of a single floodlight, I started hammering the pieces together. The rhythmic thud echoed through the stillness, a defiant heartbeat against the silence of Oak Willow Estates. By midnight, I had something that vaguely resembled a booth. Crooked, small, but sturdy. I sanded the rough edges and painted it bright red with leftover porch paint, the color glowing like fire under the moonlight. When I stepped back to look at it, I actually laughed. It was ridiculous. It was bold. It was perfect. Next came the sign. I dug through Maddie's art supplies and found a sheet of white poster board. In big black letters, I wrote, Private Drive. Access fee $5. I nailed it to the front of the booth and stood there in the night breeze, paint still tacky on my fingers. The crickets sang from the trees, and somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and went quiet again. The world was asleep, but for the first time in weeks, I felt awake, alive, even. It wasn't about money. It was about making a point. Martin had turned my driveway into a symbol of control. I was going to turn it into a symbol of freedom and pettiness, if I'm being honest. Sweet, calculated pettiness. The next morning, the booth caught the first golden slice of sunrise, and before I could even finish my coffee, the sound of laughter floated up the street. Ron Dillard, my delivery driver neighbor, stood in front of it, squinting at the sign. "You serious about this?" he asked, grinning. "Every penny," I said. "You want to use the road? You pay the toll." He chuckled and reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled $5 bill. "Worth it just to see Clive's face," he said, sliding it across the little counter I'd built. By noon, word had spread. Janet Reyes came by in her sun hat, carrying a mason jar of sweet tea. "You're either the craziest woman on this block or the bravest," she said, dropping in $5. "Maybe both." Cars slowed down just to look. Some people took photos. One man in a pickup truck honked twice and shouted, "About time." Someone stood up to him. The booth had become more than a prank. It was a rallying cry. Neighbors who had once been silent were now laughing, whispering, daring to hope that maybe Martin wasn't untouchable after all. For the first time, people weren't looking away. They were looking toward me. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, I sat beside the booth, the air thick with the smell of wood stain and the low, steady chirping of crickets. Flashlights from passing walkers flickered across my driveway, reflecting off the metal lock that had started it all. I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control. When I finally went to bed that night, I fell asleep smiling. I didn't care if Martin came after me. Let him. I wanted him to see what defiance looked like, painted in red and nailed together with borrowed nails. The next morning, I woke to the sound of tires screeching and a voice that could slice through glass. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, to see Martin Clive standing in front of the booth, his face a shade redder than the paint itself. Clipboard tucked under his arm, sunglasses glinting, he looked like a man seconds from spontaneous combustion. His voice bellowed down the street. "You can't charge people to use our road." I sipped my coffee and smiled. The game had officially begun. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing like it had caught fire. At first I thought it was spam, another HOA notice, maybe a debt collector, but the notifications kept rolling in. Hundreds of them. When I finally opened the screen, I froze. A video of my red toll booth filled the display, captioned in bold white letters, "Texas mom turns HOA lock into pay station." The voiceover was bright and amused, the kind that could make even civil disobedience sound adorable. It was Ron Dillard's TikTok, the one he'd recorded the day before, laughing as he handed me $5. The clip had been up less than 12 hours. It had over 2 million views. My heart pounded. The comments were endless. Legend. HOA got what it deserved. This is the kind of petty revenge we need. People were tagging news outlets, lawyers, even local politicians. Someone had written, "Give her a medal." Another, "I'm buying property just to join her toll road." Maddie stumbled out of her room, squinting at her phone. "Mom, you're viral." I blinked. "That's not funny." "I'm serious." She turned her screen toward me. There were reaction videos, memes, even one edit that had me photoshopped into a superhero cape under the title "The Gatekeeper." I didn't know whether to laugh or hide. Part of me felt embarrassed, but another part, the part that had been quieted by Martin's arrogance for weeks, felt something close to victory. For the first time, I wasn't the woman being humiliated on her own lawn. I was the one rewriting the story. By noon, 2 local reporters were parked outside the gate. One, a young woman with a camera crew, introduced herself with a smile. "Becca Holt, we'd love to get your side of this HOA situation. People are calling it a stand for homeowners' rights." I hadn't even brushed my hair, but I stepped in front of that booth like I was stepping onto a battlefield. "They locked me out of my own driveway," I said, voice steady. "So I charged them for access. Simple economics." Within hours, the story hit local TV. Then national outlets picked it up. "Small town mom outsmarts HOA," one headline read. The $5 revolution. I couldn't stop laughing at that one. It was ridiculous, but it was real. And the more people learned what had happened, the more messages poured in. Strangers offered donations for legal fees. Other homeowners sent photos of their own mini protests against corrupt HOAs across the country. Meanwhile, Martin Clive was losing control. He'd built his reputation on order and authority, and now his name was trending online, attached to hashtags like Maisha Lockgate and Maisha Ho Karen. He didn't take it well. That evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, a new notice appeared taped to my booth. It was printed on the usual HOA letterhead, the kind that tried too hard to look official. The words were almost shaking with indignation. Cease and desist. You are hereby ordered to remove unauthorized structures and signage immediately. Continued non-compliance will result in legal action. I laughed out loud. Maddie read it over my shoulder and said, "He's panicking." He was. Every time Martin tried to regain control, the internet swatted him back down. One of the comments under a news post read, "He violated his own bylaws, Section 9A. Somebody teach this guy democracy." I almost wanted to thank that stranger. They were right. The truth was simple. Any HOA restriction that changes homeowner access requires a 75% member vote. Martin's safety lock was a one-man order, a bluff masquerading as law. Every homeowner in Oak Willow had the right to challenge it. And now, thanks to the internet, they knew it. Neighbors who had once avoided me were starting to stop by. Janet Reyes brought over brownies and whispered, "I saw you on TV, dear." "My son says you're a hero." Ron gave me a mock salute as he drove past, shouting, "Tolls due!" For the first time, I felt the neighborhood's fear shifting, not toward me, but toward Martin. His fortress of authority was cracking, and the world was watching the pieces fall. Still, victory never comes without backlash. Late that night, I found a new letter slipped under my door. The envelope had no stamp, no signature, just the HOA's embossed seal. Inside was a single line typed in cold black ink. Emergency board meeting, immediate agenda, suspension of member privileges, Becca Holt, Lot 28. I stared at it, my pulse steady. It didn't matter anymore if they tried to shut me out. The internet had already let me in. The war wasn't just local now, it was public. And Martin Clive had just declared it official. The fame felt good for about a week. Then the retaliation began. At first, it was subtle. A new envelope in my mailbox every morning, each one stamped with the HOA logo like a warning shot. The first fine was for unauthorized signage. The second, for obstruction of shared roadway. The third claimed I'd violated neighborhood aesthetic standards because of the red paint on my booth. Every letter was signed by Martin Clive in that same smug, looping handwriting. By the fifth notice, the total fines had reached $4,950. I couldn't decide if he wanted money or my surrender. The neighbors saw what was happening, and while a few of them started to whisper encouragement, others shut their blinds. Oak Willow Estates had always been pristine, predictable. But now, every cul-de-sac, barbecue, and morning jog carried the tension of a neighborhood at war. It escalated again the following Tuesday. I was working on my laptop when a white pickup truck pulled up beside the curb. A man in a reflective vest stepped out, clipboard in hand. The logo on his shirt said, "City of Travis County Inspections." He tapped the booth with his pen and shouted, "Ma'am, we've received a report that this structure violates city code. It needs to come down." I walked outside, cautious. And who exactly filed that report? He avoided my eyes. Anonymous complaint. His voice cracked just enough to tell me he was lying. The smell of cologne hit me, and that's when I recognized him. Earl Clive, Martin's cousin. I'd seen him once at an HOA picnic, bragging about his consulting business. I folded my arms. "You're not a city inspector, Earl." He stammered. "Of course I am." "No," I cut in. "Real inspectors carry ID. Badges, clipboards with city seals. You've got none of that." He froze for a second, then turned back toward the truck. Just trying to keep the peace, he muttered before peeling away, gravel spitting from his tires. I took out my phone and filmed the entire exchange. The shaking in my hands wasn't fear, it was exhaustion mixed with disbelief. This wasn't about property anymore. It was about power, intimidation, and a man so desperate to maintain control that he'd weaponized his own family to do it. From that night on, I started documenting everything. Every letter, every notice, every late-night knock on the door that led to no one standing outside. I kept a notebook on my kitchen counter, logging every event down to the minute. When I caught the sound of a car idling in front of my house around midnight, I began recording that too. My phone became my shield, my only defense in a battle fought with paperwork and paranoia. But even shields get heavy. The constant stress began to seep into everything. My work, my sleep, my ability to smile at my daughter without that edge of fear. One night around 2 a.m., I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by files and my growing pile of evidence. My eyes burned from fatigue. My chest felt hollow. Maddie appeared in the doorway, her face half lit by the hallway nightlight. "You're still awake?" she asked. "I'm just organizing," I said, closing the laptop, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. She came over, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to do this all alone, Mom. I started this. I have to finish it." She shook her head gently. "You're not just doing this for us. You're doing it for everyone who's scared of people like him." Her words broke something open inside me. I hadn't realized until then how much this fight had consumed me. I was tired, but she was right. I couldn't stop now. Not when so many were watching, hoping someone would finally stand up to the kind of quiet tyranny that had ruled this neighborhood for years. The next morning, I met Clint for coffee downtown. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept either. I slid the folder of documentation across the table. "He's faking fines now. Even sent his cousin to impersonate an inspector." Clint skimmed through the pages, whistling low. "He's crossing into criminal territory, Becca. Fraud. Harassment. Maybe even impersonation of a government official." He flipped to one of the HOA financial statements I'd printed from the county website. His expression changed. "Wait," he said slowly, tapping a line near the bottom of the page. "Do you see this? Safety audit expenditure. $2,500. But look at the date." I leaned in. "That's the week he locked my driveway." Clint nodded. "Exactly. And it's paid to a company called SafePath Consulting. Never heard of them." He pulled out his laptop, typing furiously. After a moment, he looked up, his jaw tight. "Becca, SafePath Consulting doesn't exist. No registration, no tax record. It's a shell." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You mean he's stealing from the HOA?" Clint's voice was grim. "More than that. He's been creating fake audits to justify those locks and fines. He's pocketing the money." The air around us seemed to thicken. Everything suddenly made sense. The obsession with control, the panic over exposure, the harassment meant to shut me down. Clint leaned forward. "You've got him cornered. Keep your records safe. This isn't just an HOA fight anymore. This is fraud." I sat back, clutching my coffee cup as the weight of his words sank in. Martin Clive hadn't just abused power. He'd stolen from every single homeowner in Oak Willow Estates. And now, I had the proof. Clint and I spent the next few nights buried in documents, surrounded by printouts, spreadsheets, and late-night coffee cups that stained every surface of my dining table. My house, once filled with the warmth of ordinary life, now looked like a war room. The HOA's financial records were all there, and so were the lies hiding between the numbers. The deeper we dug, the more rot we found. Martin's so-called safety audits were paid to a company called SafePath Consulting LLC. But when Clint searched the Texas Business Registry, there was nothing. No address, no filings, no tax records. The supposed contractor for the lock installations, Travis Gate and Security, didn't exist either. They were ghost companies. Shells. Clint rubbed his eyes, scrolling through transaction logs. "He's been funneling HOA dues into fake invoices," he muttered, "probably laundering them through an unregistered account." I stared at the spreadsheet, a sick feeling twisting in my stomach. So everyone in this neighborhood, everyone paying their monthly dues, has been funding his scams. He nodded grimly. And you were his biggest threat because you questioned it. That realization hit like a punch to the chest. Every fake fine, every late-night intimidation, it wasn't just about punishing me. It was about protecting his empire of lies. I pushed back from the table, pacing the living room. We need proof, not just paperwork. Something that connects him directly to the fraud. Clint looked up, cautious. That means confrontation. Are you sure you're ready for that? My pulse quickened. I'm not sure, I admitted, but I'm done being scared. That night, I sat in my car across from the HOA office, a modest brick building at the edge of the subdivision, usually empty after 5. Through the blinds, I saw Martin's SUV still parked out front. The street was quiet, the air thick with humidity. I took a deep breath, pressed record on my phone, and walked in. He looked up from behind his desk, startled but quickly hiding it behind his usual smirk. "Rebecca," he said, his voice calm and patronizing. "Still fighting windmills, I see." I placed a manila folder on the desk. "I found your safety audit reports. Every one of them fake. There's no Safe Path Consulting. No contractors. Just invoices you wrote yourself." He chuckled softly. "You really don't understand how associations work, do you?" "I understand theft," I said flatly. For a moment, the mask slipped. His jaw tightened, the fake charm fading into something sharper. "Careful what you accuse people of," he said, his tone dropping low. "Words like that can get expensive." "Not as expensive as felony fraud," I replied. He leaned back, smiling again, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "You think anyone will believe you? You're a single mom with a toll booth. I'm the president of this community." I didn't respond. Instead, I let the silence stretch, the soft hum of the ceiling fan filling the space. My phone was still recording from inside my jacket pocket. I didn't need to argue. I just needed him to keep talking. He did. "You've embarrassed this neighborhood," he said, his voice dripping venom. "When this blows over, you'll wish you'd just paid your fines and kept quiet." "Maybe," I said, standing up. "But right now, you should wish you hadn't said that on record." His face went pale. "On record?" I held up my phone. "Texas is a one-party consent state, Martin. I don't need your permission to record this conversation. And I just caught you admitting retaliation and misappropriation." For a second, he didn't breathe. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You're making a mistake." I smiled, cold and steady. "No. I'm fixing one." I walked out before he could speak again, my hands shaking as I climbed into the car. The night air smelled of rain and asphalt, thick and electric. My heart hammered in my chest, but beneath the adrenaline was something else, relief. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was fighting back with proof. At home, Clint was waiting, his laptop open. Together, we compiled the files, the invoices, payment records, and now the recording. When I hit send on the email to the Travis County District Attorney's office, the screen blinked for a moment, then confirmed. Message sent. All the fear, humiliation, and anger of the past weeks seemed to dissolve into one breath. It was done. I'd finally drawn blood. The next afternoon, my phone rang from an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Ms. Holt?" a man's voice said. "This is Detective Alvarez with the Travis County Financial Crimes Division. We received your email and your evidence." My throat went dry. "Yes?" He paused for a beat before continuing. "We need to talk about your HOA president." The call from Detective Alvarez came on a Wednesday morning, just as the Texas sky was starting to turn that unbearable white-hot shade that only July can make. His voice was calm, professional, but heavy with implication. "Ms. Holt, thank you for your cooperation. We're executing a warrant on the Oak Willow Estates HOA this afternoon. You might want to stay home." My hand tightened around the phone. "You're really doing it?" "Yes, ma'am." Your documents gave us probable cause. Stay clear of the area. It's about to get busy. I hung up, heart pounding. For days, I'd been living in a quiet storm. The waiting, the watching, the knowing something big was coming. But when it finally did, it didn't feel real at first. By 2 p.m., the sound of sirens broke through the stillness of our neighborhood. Two black county SUVs rolled down Oak Willow Lane, followed by an unmarked sedan. They stopped in front of the HOA office, that tidy brick building Martin loved to call the command center. Within minutes, men and women in plain clothes began filing out, badges gleaming in the sun. I stood at my window, curtain barely parted, heart thundering. Then came the sound. A sharp knock, then the echo of a door forced open. The officers flooded inside, voices firm, authoritative. Neighbors began to gather, one by one, curiosity turning the quiet street into a crowd. It didn't take long for Martin to appear. He stormed out of the building, red-faced and shouting, still clutching his clipboard like it was a shield. "This is an outrage," he barked. "These are private records. You can't just barge in here." But the officers didn't flinch. They moved past him, carrying boxes and sealed evidence bags. Laptops, file binders, stacks of documents labeled expenditure reports and safety audits. Someone across the street, I think it was Ron, had his phone out, recording everything. A few others followed. By the time Martin realized he was being filmed, it was too late. He turned toward them, his face twisted with that same arrogance I'd seen a dozen times before. "Stop recording. You have no right," he shouted. Janet Reyes, bless her brave heart, stepped forward. "We have every right, Martin," she said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "This is our neighborhood, not your empire." Her words drew murmurs of agreement, then applause. Soft at first, then stronger. The crowd that had once cowered under his glare was now standing tall, united by shared anger and vindication. The officers loaded the last of the boxes into their vehicles, one of them holding up a sealed laptop bag with Martin's name tagged on it. He kept sputtering protests. "This is all a misunderstanding. I've done nothing wrong." But the cracks in his voice told another story. The man who once ruled with unshakable authority was unraveling in broad daylight. From where I stood, I could see his composure crumble piece by piece. His tie hung crooked, his shirt clung with sweat, and that polished confidence had vanished, replaced by raw panic. The same man who once called the cops on me now had them hauling away his files. By evening, the story was everywhere. Local news vans swarmed the street, cameras rolling, reporters narrating live. I watched from my living room as my own neighborhood flashed across the television screen. Breaking news: HOA president under investigation for fraud and abuse of power. The image cut to Martin, mid-shout, his hand outstretched toward the camera, the headline burning across the bottom of the screen like a final verdict. Maddie sat beside me, her knees pulled to her chest. "He looks scared," she said quietly. I nodded. "He should be." The next day, the whispers became cheers. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before stopped by my booth, just to thank me. "You gave us courage," one woman said, tears in her eyes. Another pressed a folded note into my hand. "We're proud of you, Becca. You stood up when no one else could." It was surreal. For weeks I'd been fighting to prove I wasn't crazy, that what Martin was doing was real. And now the world knew it too. Late that night, my phone buzzed again. It was Clint. His voice carried the weight of both triumph and warning. "Becca, the DA's office is moving forward. They're preparing formal charges. Fraud, embezzlement, misuse of community funds. It's big." I sat down, the words settling over me like thunder after lightning. "It's really over, isn't it?" "Almost," Clint said. "But there's something else. The press is running the story tomorrow. They're naming you as the whistleblower." My stomach flipped. "Me?" "Yeah," he said softly. "You started this. You exposed him. They're calling you the homeowner who fought the HOA. And won." I didn't know whether to smile or cry. The lock that once humiliated me had now become a symbol of resistance. Martin's empire was collapsing, and my name was on the front line of justice. I set my phone down, staring out the window where the booth still stood under the porch light. My toll booth, my rebellion, my proof that one small act of defiance could bring a giant to his knees. The Travis County Courthouse was colder than I expected. Maybe it was the air conditioning, or maybe it was the weight of everything that had led me there. Months of humiliation, fear, and late nights spent fighting a war I never asked for. The echo of my heels on the marble floor sounded louder than it should have. When I stepped into the courtroom, I saw him, Martin Clive, sitting at the defense table, arms crossed, jaw tight, wearing the same smug expression he'd worn the day he called the police on me. He looked smaller now, though. Not physically, but in presence. The crowd behind me was filled with familiar faces, neighbors, reporters, even Janet Reyes with her hands folded around her purse like she was praying for justice. Maddie sat in the second row beside Clint, her hand resting nervously on his sleeve. When the judge entered, the murmurs died instantly. The case, State of Texas versus Martin Clive, began with the sterile rhythm of procedure. Exhibits introduced, witnesses sworn, lawyers addressing the bench. But beneath that formality, tension simmered like a live wire. The prosecution didn't waste time. They laid out the financial trail. Over $40,000 in HOA funds diverted into non-existent companies. Fake audits. Phantom safety inspections. The forged signatures of board members who'd never even seen the documents. Each piece of evidence felt like a hammer against the foundation of Martin's so-called empire. When they played the audio recording I'd captured, Martin's own voice mocking me, admitting to making up rules to keep control, the room went silent. The jury leaned forward, the judge's brow furrowed. Martin's attorney tried to object, but it was too late. The words hung in the air, undeniable. Then came the moment I dreaded most. My turn to testify. My palms were damp, my throat tight, but I kept my eyes steady on the judge. I told them everything. The lock, the harassment, the fines, the fake inspector, the fear of standing alone in my driveway while my daughter watched me being treated like a criminal. I described the toll booth, how it started as defiance, but became a lifeline. By the time I finished, the courtroom was silent except for the faint scratching of pens on paper. Martin refused to look at me. When his lawyer finally called him to the stand, the confidence he'd built his identity on started to unravel. He stumbled over dates, contradicted his own filings, and when pressed about Safe Path Consulting, he hesitated too long before claiming ignorance. The prosecutor pounced. "You signed the checks, Mr. Clive. Are you suggesting someone forged your signature on every fraudulent invoice?" His voice cracked. "It was a mistake. Accounting error." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Even the judge's tone hardened. "Mr. Clive, your error violated fiduciary duty, the very foundation of your office. Board members are obligated to act in the best interest of the homeowners, not themselves. Breach of that duty isn't just unethical, it's criminal." That word, criminal, seemed to echo off the walls. When the verdict came, I didn't breathe. The jury foreman stood, papers trembling slightly in his hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on counts of fraud, misuse of community funds, and abuse of authority." My knees went weak. The judge's voice followed, strong and steady. "Mr. Clive, you are hereby removed from your position as HOA president, fined and barred from holding any fiduciary office for 10 years. All unauthorized fines collected from Ms. Holt will be refunded in full, and her property access permanently restored." Maddie let out a sob of relief behind me. I turned and she mouthed, "You did it." The judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he said, glancing over his glasses, "this court orders the Oak Willow Estates HOA to issue a public apology and pay restitution for its wrongful enforcement actions." Gasps rippled through the room. Martin's face drained of color. It was over. But the words public apology echoed in my mind like a promise of poetic justice. The lock that once trapped me was gone. Now it was his turn to face the key turning against him. A month after the verdict, Oak Willow Estates looked different. Brighter, freer, almost human again. The lawns weren't as perfectly trimmed, the rules weren't barked through newsletters, and for the first time in years, neighbors actually talked to each other. The fear that had hung over every front porch had finally lifted. And right there at the edge of my driveway, where the lock once mocked me, stood the Freedom Gate. What used to be my red toll booth was now a small flower stand. Maddie's idea. She painted the sign herself in looping blue script. The Freedom Gate, fresh blooms, honest roots. Every Saturday, she arranged sunflowers, daisies, and wildflowers in mason jars, and the neighbors came not just to buy, but to connect. Janet Reyes donated seedlings, Ron built a little bench beside it, and every sale had a story. One neighbor even slipped a note into the tip jar that said, "Thank you for opening more than a gate." It was strange how something that began as a symbol of anger had transformed into one of hope. Sometimes, as I watched Maddie laugh with customers, I realized that the lock Martin had used to control us had ended up unlocking the community instead. The HOA had been restructured under new leadership. This time, real leadership. Elections were open, votes were counted publicly, and the new president, a retired teacher named Gloria Ward, made her first order of business the repeal of every one of Martin's arbitrary policies. For once, the words community safety actually meant something. Porch lights that worked, kids playing without fear, and a shared sense that Oak Willow belonged to its residents again. Martin, on the other hand, was gone. No farewell party, no speeches, just a moving truck that pulled away before dawn one humid Friday morning. Rumor had it he'd sold his house below market value to pay restitution and court fees. The man who once strutted around the neighborhood like a general now couldn't even look anyone in the eye. His name had become a warning, not a title. I didn't miss him. But I did keep one reminder. On my desk, beside my laptop and a potted fern, sits half of that old brass lock. Cracked and tarnished. The same one that started everything. Sometimes I run my fingers over its jagged edge when I'm working late and smile. It reminds me that even the strongest locks are just metal waiting to break. One afternoon, as the scent of wildflowers drifted through the open window, my email pinged. I almost ignored it until I saw the subject line. Media inquiry, feature story request. The sender's name made me blink. A producer from a national morning show. "We'd love to share your story with our viewers." The message read, "The mom who turned an HOA lock into a movement." I sat back, the afternoon light spilling across my desk, the broken lock catching a flash of gold. I had no idea my story had traveled that far, but deep down, I knew one thing. This wasn't the end. It was just another gate opening. They called it safety. I call it control. And sometimes the only way to fight control is to make them pay to pass through it. Looking back now, I realize this fight was never just about a lock or a driveway. It was about power. The quiet, suffocating kind that hides behind polite emails and printed bylaws. The kind that convinces you you're powerless until you remember that ink and paper only have meaning when people agree to obey them. I stopped agreeing. The brass lock that once humiliated me became my greatest teacher. It taught me that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it builds a toll booth out of scrap wood and defiance. It taught me that one person standing up, even shaking, can change the entire direction of a community. And it taught me that when people say, "It's just the HOA," they often mean, "I'm too scared to fight back." But fear doesn't keep a neighborhood safe. Truth does. If you're watching this, and you've ever felt trapped by a board, a boss, or a system that thinks it owns you, hear me clearly. You have rights. You have power. You don't need permission to demand fairness. Learn your bylaws. Read your property lines. Ask questions at every meeting, because the moment you start asking, the bullies start sweating. I didn't win because I had money or influence. I won because I refused to be silent. And you can too. So tell me, have you ever faced an HOA that went too far? Maybe they fined you for the wrong color of paint, or harassed you for planting a garden. Maybe they called it safety when it was really just control. I want to hear it. Share your story in the comments below. Your battle might be next week's feature. Because every neighborhood has a Martin Clive, and every community needs a Becca Holt. And for those who stood with me, every like, every message, every word of support, thank you. You reminded me that justice isn't just found in courtrooms. Sometimes it starts in a driveway. If you've ever felt powerless against an HOA or watched your rights get padlocked behind community rules, this story is your reminder. You're not alone, and you can fight back. Tell me below, what's the craziest thing your HOA or city board ever did to you? Your story might be the next one I bring to life right here on this channel. Hit like if you'd stand your ground the way Becca did, and subscribe if you believe in holding power accountable, one neighborhood at a time. Let's turn every HOA horror story into a victory together.